Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Galia Golan, who is a professor in the Lauder School of Government, Diplomacy and Strategy in Herzliya, Israel. Professor Golan came to the IDC from a long career at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where, as Darwin Professor of Soviet and East European Studies, she served as chair of the Department of Political Science, chair of the Laffer Center for Women's Studies, and chair of the Mayrock Center for East European and Eurasian Studies. Galia, welcome back to Berkeley.
Thank you.
Where were you born and raised?
Well, I was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, but I was raised sort of all over in Florida, Chicago, Boston, and then we lived in Europe.
And looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your thinking about the world?
I didn't come from a political family. I came from a very, very secular, even anti-religious family, and a very independent mother, which is, I think, made a great difference in my life because it made it possible, she was working in Europe, made it possible for me to study in Europe. And that's where basically I formed many of my views, certainly my political views.
And was there a discussion of politics around the dinner table?
Never.
Never?
Never. No discussion of politics. My brother's an artist. My mother was a buyer, a jewelry buyer. No, there was no politics, except at one point I lived with my mother. We lived with my mother's brother. He worked for Pan American as a purser and would travel to South Africa. And when I was 16, he told me about apartheid and the situation. And that had an enormous effect on me.
And what about, as you traveled around the country, any teachers that influenced you towards this concern with the great issues of politics?
I think it's very hard to say. I went to high school, my last 2 years of high school in Forest Hills, New York, and it was the kids, it was my friends who were radical, and we'd go to Pete Seeger concerts and so forth. This was the 1950s, and so combined with what I had learned about apartheid, civil rights already hit me, so to speak, in high school. And then I went on to Brandeis and was, of course, radical. This is the late 50s. I graduated in 60. So it really came through the civil rights movement, I think.
And at Brandeis, any mentors or professors there that influenced you, or was it just the left-wing students?
No, I was a protege of Marcuse. I studied with him at Brandeis. I was a philosophy student, and then I studied with him in Europe, and I was with him in Paris. Clearly, although I wasn't a Marxist, and he knew that, but that didn't stop him from supporting me. And we were very close as a family, so to speak. So yes, of course, he had an enormous influence. But Brandeis altogether in those years was fantastic. I mean, Abe Maslow was there, and Frank Manuel, and Berkowitz. It was a tremendously active place, intellectual, extraordinary influence on me, in my opinion.
And and looking back, what was the most important thing that you think Marcuse taught you, or what insights did he leave you with that influenced your future research?
Well, one thing, it's not necessarily what was in his books, but just in knowing him. Frankly, I'll never forget some comment he made, and I was very flattered. I made some comment after class, and he said, "Yes, my dear, but you've got to remember that you're one of 7% intellectuals in the world." And I was very flattered he put me in that category, but it really did do a reality check. You know, 7%, even that seems a high figure. And it sort of gave me an idea that my views were going to remain views of a minority, not necessarily a tiny minority, but it sort of put me in place, so to speak.
And it was after graduation from Brandeis that you emigrated to Israel? Actually?
No, I went to France and studied there with Marcuse.
I see. Oh, okay.
And then I came back, and then I emigrated in 1962. It was 40 years. 40 years ago, 1966, I immigrated.
And then you went on to do your graduate work at Hebrew University,
right.
and what did you finally focus on there?
Well, in the course of living abroad, mainly in Paris, I shifted from philosophy. I did my MA on Marx's concept of freedom, but I shifted to East European studies, mainly because while I was living in Europe, I traveled a lot to Eastern Europe, and I really was quite horrified. I had never seen a dictatorship. It doesn't matter whether it was left or right. I had never seen anything like it, and decided to leave philosophy and go into East European studies, so that by the time I immigrated to Israel and had to do my doctorate, I did it on Czechoslovakia, on the reform movement that was just coming in Czechoslovakia. And so my first two books, in fact, were on the Czechoslovak reform movement. And then only very gradually I got into the Soviet stuff. A lot of East European specialists somehow graduate to the Soviet area. I didn't mean for it to happen, but it happened in the Yom Kippur War in 1973. I was asked by our Knesset, the Foreign Affairs Committee, to sort of keep them up to date on the Soviet involvement during the war, put together a team. And so I started following it. And then right after that, there was a conference, semi-sponsored by the International Institute of Strategic Studies. And I wrote a paper for that on the Soviet involvement in the war. And when my husband...
This was which war now?
1973. I was in the 67 war.
I see.
But I wasn't doing anything academically. But the 73 war, I did quite a bit of research on the Soviet involvement. And when my husband was a doctor in an artillery unit. When he came back from 4 months of war and mobilization, he said, well, you've already done all of this, why don't you write a book on it? And so I literally left one desk where I was writing a book on Eastern Europe, moved over to another desk, and wrote the book on the Soviet Union, the Yom Kippur War, and after that, everything was the Soviet Union.
And I have two questions about the Soviet Union. I know that your career has changed into other issues more focused on peace and conflict resolution and so on. But the two questions, were you surprised when the Soviet Union collapsed?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I make no claim to having seen it ahead of time or even believed that it was possible. I went back to Czechoslovakia together with Shimon Peres, who was then finance minister in Israel. And it was a few months after the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia. And I heard on the radio that he was going, so I called him and said, I'm coming with you. And I did. I had not been in Czechoslovakia since 1961. And I simply couldn't believe it. I would never, and I said to myself at the time, I would never have believed that I would see Czechoslovakia without the communist regime. No, I didn't foresee it. I did raise the issue academically. I even tried to get an article published in the New York Times about it, of the similarity between Gorbachev and Dubček in their policies, and how what was inevitable for Dubček is that if these policies had been put into effect, the party would lose power. He didn't think it would lose power, but it would have. Pluralism would have defeated it. And I pointed out the similarity, and did Gorbachev know this? I mean, if I, sitting out here, saw it, surely he knew. It turned out later when I met him that he had in fact been a roommate of Zdeněk Mlynář, who was one of the fathers of the political reform in the Czech reform movement. And so they were in touch with each other, which meant that Gorbachev knew where these reforms would lead, that they would lead to pluralism. But I certainly don't think he thought it would lead to collapse.
And of course, Dubček was a Czechoslovakian reformer whose reform effort was clamped down by the Soviets.
By the Soviets.
Yes.
He was, by bringing in the reform, and as I said, it's a reform that ultimately was clearly going to lead to pluralism, a pluralistic system. And he believed that communism could survive in an election, in a free election. And it was the Soviets who saw the threat to the leading role of the party if this kind of thing came in. And I assume that Gorbachev saw that, but assumed that he could weather it and that the party would weather it.
Looking back during this Cold War period, I would like for you to talk a little about, in retrospect, was the superpower conflict in the Middle East more stable in retrospect than we realized?
Yes, I think so. One of the things that I tried to point out when I moved into this Soviets in the Middle East area What I was struck by was that, contrary to sort of popular opinion, the Soviets were not egging on the Arabs to go to war. They were, in fact, a restraining factor, mainly because they were afraid, given the American commitment and their own commitment, that this could lead to World War III. And therefore, while they armed the Arabs, as the United States armed Israel, they tried to restrain them. So that I think it's not only looking back, but at the time, I felt it was important that we understand that the Soviets, while you could say the supply of arms is not a positive thing, but as I said, America supplied Israel, the Soviets did not want the Arabs to go to war. And in fact, that's one of the reasons that Sadat threw out the Soviet advisors in the military in 1972. Let them back in only in a very limited way. So I think that in that sense, yes, the Cold War was a relatively stabilizing factor, the fact that both superpowers were involved. On the other hand, it did make it into a powder keg, because you had the arms race and you had jockeying for position. Ultimately, I think that the Soviets and the Americans were interested in a peace agreement and something coming out of it, so long as both of them played a role. But of course, Kissinger squeezed the Soviets out and went on his own, which ultimately worked, so I can't complain about it. But I do not think that the Soviets were necessarily an obstacle to reaching agreement.
During this period, what was Israel's role vis-a-vis U.S. foreign policy in the Cold War?
Well, certainly Israel was dependent upon it. And in that sense, the Cold War was very helpful because it drew these very, very clear lines. Until, I would say, until President Kennedy and perhaps Johnson, the Americans really had what could be called an even-handed attitude, certainly under Eisenhower, and to some degree under Kennedy. And it was basically the Cold War, when the Soviets came in strongly after 1955, when they came in strongly on the side of the Arabs. Gradually, it was only gradually, the Americans sort of shifted in a very serious way to providing arms finally under Johnson to Israel. And I think that's where the real commitment comes to some degree with Kennedy and then with Johnson. I doubt that I can't be sure it would have come if there had not been a Cold War. It might have, because you have the Jewish lobby in the United States, of course. That initial support came because of that, mainly. But I think the Cold War was a very major factor at that time.
Mm-hmm. So what I would like to ask you next is this. How has Israel changed since the time when you first came there? Now, here I'm talking about the domestic political situation. Let's start with, what difference did the emigration of Soviet Jews make for Israel's domestic politics?
I think the changes came before. I think the changes came primarily with globalization. Israel joined globalization in the late 80s. And Israel's changed enormously. I immigrated in 1966, exactly 40 years ago. It was a socialist country. It had a mixed economy, but it had a very strong welfare state, a good deal of social justice. We had the lowest gap between rich and poor in the world. And today we have the highest or the second highest, only behind the U.S. It has changed enormously. The welfare state has been dismembered. We have privatization running wild, which, by the way, began with the Labor Party in the 80s. So it has changed enormously. On one hand, you're getting this individualism, liberal philosophy, which is associated with capitalism and privatization, rather than the old communal socialist attitude. And it's not a positive change. And of course, you have the religious having even greater political power, which certainly hasn't helped matters. Then comes the Russian immigration. I don't think the Russian immigration has changed things entirely. In other words, I can't really blame them for everything, because the trends were there. And I do think globalization had a big effect. But there's no question that we're talking about 1 million people, a very large number of voters. And they, like most immigrations, tend to vote with the party that's in power, but they are ideologically right-wing, according to the polls. And today, I think they form the bulk of the support for Lieberman,
Who is tell our audience.
Right, Avigdor Lieberman is a Russian immigrant who set up he was in fact Bibi Netanyahu's chief of staff, so to speak, extremely right-wing. And then he set up his own Russian immigrant party. And now he's being fairly successful, and he's extremely right-wing. He has openly racist views. He once said we should bomb the Aswan Dam, for example. And more to the point, he's the main supporter of an idea that has some support in Israel of changing our borders. Give up the West Bank, that's fine from his point of view, but redo the borders so that the Arab areas, or areas that are predominantly Arab in the northern part of Israel, or the northeastern part, would then become part of the Palestinian state, and then parts of the West Bank where there are a lot of settlements would become part of Israel. So that he's talking about a population transfer, not by picking up the population, but by changing the border, of course without permission of the inhabitants. And this is a policy that he's advocating, which is, I think, extremely dangerous and racist.
Has Israel's history of creating settlements in the occupied lands led it unintentionally and over time to become more and more like apartheid South Africa?
Unfortunately, yes. I hate to use the term. I find it repugnant. I like to think we're not there yet because our legislation inside Israel certainly isn't apartheid. But you have a situation where in the occupied territories there are roads that Palestinians are not allowed to ride on. The area is chopped up into segments with checkpoints everywhere you turn, all in the name theoretically of security, but have nothing to do with security. And it's certainly in the occupied territories, you look around and it's certainly apartheid that's taking place. Now, if Israel were to annex these territories, then you would have official apartheid. But one of the reasons Israel doesn't officially annex the territories is it was bring in 3 million, 3.5 million Palestinians, and we already have 1 million Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. So that's the reason that no government, including the right-wing governments, has ever annexed the territory. But by settling it and controlling it, and control is the main word here, it's controlling not just the outer borders, but it's controlling movement from village to village or town to town. That's occupation.
And in fact, the recent wrinkle is that graduate students and people who are Palestinian who would study at Hebrew University, for example, are not being given permission to come and study, I guess, for security reasons.
I think that's, well,
is that happening?
No, Palestinian students who are citizens of Israel, no problem.
No, but in the area.
There were not many who would come into Israel to study. The real problem is Palestinian students who live in Gaza and cannot get to the universities in the West Bank. Or if they're there, they can't get home to visit their families. That's the thing. Now, more recently, there's been an effort to limit people with American or non-Palestinian or Israeli or Jordanian passports. In other words, Palestinians, for the most part, who had lived abroad and had, say, American passports. There are a number of businessmen like this. And now they are being limited. Very often they've come back, they've been living in Palestine, in the occupied territories, and today are getting deportation rules, or they have to they're not getting their visas renewed. And there's just serious problem economically. So there are all of these things. But the major problem is the movement within the occupied territories. We're not even talking about coming into Israel to work, because that's long since been finished. But it's freedom of movement within the occupied territories. And I don't think people quite grasp how serious that is.
You are a product of Jewish idealism. You went to Brandeis, you studied under Marcuse. You are a political scientist who studied power. The Jewish people experienced the Holocaust in World War II. What is the dynamic that is putting Israel on this path that you just described, which goes against these trajectories, you know, and the insights that they offer?
Well, you know, it's strange because you can have, particularly amongst American Jewish immigrants, you can have people who are progressive in their thinking, care about human rights, and they get to Israel, and that's all true and all well and good, except it doesn't apply to the Arabs. And I've seen amazing phenomenon of this type, this clear contradiction between what I would call progressive values and policy with regard to the occupied territories. I think it comes from this sense of victimhood, which is predominant. And it's an amazing thing to me that after so many years that the State of Israel has existed with our powerful army and our performance until the summer in a number of wars, that there would still persist this tremendous sense of victimhood, that we are the victims, that everybody hates us. The fact that we have 2 peace agreements, one with Egypt, one with Jordan, you still hear we're surrounded by enemies. And you say, wait a second, do a reality check here. Who's the enemy? What are we fighting here? Any kind of criticism that comes from Europe is labeled anti-Semitism. And there is anti-Semitism out there. But there is this sense, and it must be very, very deep. It's not just the Holocaust, it's a whole history. And that even people who've been born and raised in Israel, who've been born and raised in what should be a secure environment, have this same sense. And one of the reasons is that the governments from the very beginning nurtured this insecurity, play on the Holocaust, and how everybody's against us, whether it's shmum or it's the goyim, or however you want to put it. And so that even your strong, healthy, mighty Sabra still has a sense that everybody hates us and everybody, that our very existence is in jeopardy.
Tell us now what peace movement, the Peace Now movement is, and your involvement in its founding. You were one of the founders. You were a spokesperson. What did it represent in Israeli politics from the time of its birth through the present?
Well, Peace Now is actually quite unique in Israeli history because there had been left-wing peace groups, and I'd been involved on the fringes of a peace group that had started in the university, intellectuals. The Communist Party always had some peace movement, and there were even some very, very tiny, extreme left-wing peace groups. None of them ever really caught on, including the intellectuals. The unique thing about Peace Now, and I think the reason that it caught on, is that while I was involved from the beginning, the people who founded the movement were a group of young reserve officers and soldiers. Many of them were our students, and that's how we knew about it. And the fact they wrote an open letter to the Prime Minister, which they published during the talks over the Israeli-Egyptian peace agreement, and when the talks were breaking down. And they were very similar in a way to the movement that started recently called the Courage to Refuse. And what these young men said in their letter, and there was one young woman, Yuli Tamir, who's Minister of Education today, what they said in their letter was that we're loyal, we fight, we're in combat units, some volunteer units, but we will have a problem continuing to serve if we feel that the government isn't doing enough, or will let this opportunity for peace now fall through its fingers. And this is what struck a chord, I think, with the Israeli public. That is, it came out of the heart of Israel, fighters, young men who, it was very machoistic, security conscious, protecting Israel, willing to do much for Israel. It was that. Nobody could call them, certainly nobody could call them disloyal. And as a result, the movement became a mass movement. It's the only time a peace movement, or any movement really in Israel, has become a mass movement and is held all these years. And I think it's because it appeals to that, not just to the left, but sort of the center or the left of center. It's a movement that tries to be only a little bit ahead of the public, as distinct from what I would call the radical left, which is out there way ahead of the public, and they don't care if they're small. But Peace Now has always had the idea that our strength is in our numbers. If we can get out a demonstration of 100,000, 200,000, we've had the big one, of course, during the first Lebanon War, 400,000, that's our strength. That's why people pay attention to us. That's why politicians pay attention to us. And so we try not to be too far ahead of the public so that we can keep that public coming out. Now, it has its problems. And the problem occurred just now in the Lebanon War this summer.
And what is that, the problem? I mean, the movement has never really entered the government, or a government, in the way the Greens did in Germany.
Right. That's true, nor the way the settlers did. The settlers tended to get certain politicians and virtually the religious party, the National Religious Party. No, we faced that a number of times. Every election somebody says we should become a party, but then we'd wind up having maybe 2 seats, if that much. That was never our idea. We wanted, and some of our people did go on to be Knesset members, either from Labor or from the Social Democratic Party, Meretz, which I'm also in the executive. Because we felt that we wanted to cover the center all the way to the left. We didn't want to be identified with the political party. Not only that, political parties and politicians have a negative image, and we did not want to be part of that. We're an extra-parliamentary movement which could speak to a broad spectrum of people, and that's where we decided we wanted to stay, even if individuals built themselves through the movement and then went on to party politics.
Mm-hmm. And I'm curious as to what the reaction of the movement has been to the Second Lebanon War. I mean, in other words, what was the sense of the existential threat so great in this war that it was impossible to mobilize on the issue of peace? Now, clearly there was mobilization on the issue of the management and competence of the leadership of the country.
Well, the war was very problematic for the peace movement. First of all, because the majority of the public, 80 to 90% of the public, saw this as what was called a just war and a war for our existence, which I find, frankly, extraordinary. The sense in the movement, in the leadership of the movement, it was certainly that Israel had a right to respond. We were attacked. It was unprovoked. The question was how you respond, and do you escalate into full-scale war? Do you bomb infrastructure and civilian targets? And our problem really was that, you start with this justification. That is to say, everybody in the country, virtually, or certainly the Jewish public, felt that we were justified in the sense that we had a right to respond. So I say the issue was how you respond. But our problem, our second problem, was that the vast majority of the public, including our public, supported the war because our civilians were being bombed. Mm-hmm. We had the population in the north of the country was not evacuated, left of their own accord, went south, and civilians were being bombed in Haifa and in villages and towns. And so the public felt threatened. And we could not have begun to get out numbers. Now, there was a division within the movement itself, and myself and a number of other people felt that in any case, there are times when you come out, even if you're small, so you can't hold a massive demonstration, and that's for sure, but at least to come out in opposition. But there were those who said that if we are too far ahead of the public at this point, we'll lose them, and then when we need them. And part of the argument was that we as a movement, and the peace camp in general, have long fought for the idea of withdrawing from the occupied territories, withdrawing to a recognized border. And then you have all the legitimacy in the world. Well, here we had the situation of having withdrawn from Lebanon, internationally recognized border, truly no provocation by Israel, and we're attacked. And if we're going to hold by this argument that this is what we should do, that Israel should withdraw, then we can defend our borders, how can we argue against this defense of our border now? I don't adhere to this logic, but this was the logic. And I can tell you very frankly that it wasn't a question of a few people. I mean, later when I sort of appeared with others in the media and so forth, people who were very clear left-wing supporters of Peace Now, that's how they felt, that you could not oppose this war. I have to add another thing, is the Israeli public, for the most part, didn't see what we were doing in Lebanon. Unless you watched the BBC or CNN or Sky, you didn't really see it. What we saw...
Once the war started.
Once the war started.
Yeah.
What you saw on television was houses, civilian houses, homes being hit by missiles and Katyusha rockets. That's what we saw. So if you talked about what we were doing, the lack of proportionality in what we were doing in Lebanon, they'd say, yeah, but they're bombing our factories. You know, it was a very, very hard sell. After the war, as you mentioned, there's this protest movement, which we have not joined, that basically is saying we didn't do enough, that the government made mistakes, it didn't let the army use more force to do what the army knows how to do. That's not where we are. And what we came out with and have come out very strongly with is we shouldn't be talking about how better to prepare for war, but how to prevent the next war. And we've actually started a campaign to speak with Syria, for example, to initiate a new peace process and to get out of the territories.
One gets the sense in looking at Israel from the outside that all these problems are intertwined, basically, and there is an incapacity, other than in movements like Peace Now, to confront the issues. You clearly have Israeli settlers who basically think that the occupied land is theirs because it was given by God. This leads to an occupation which does not work, basically, nor does unilateral disengagement from a particular area. And this, in turn, leads to a focus on terrorism and a misidentification of the adversary. And I guess what I'm stumbling at is, how does one untangle all of this? Because it seems the occupation is corrupting Israel, but at a certain point one can't separate your adversaries, basically, and you want to lump the Iranians in with Hamas, in with Hezbollah.
Well, certainly the government is lumping them all together. I mean, even in this past war, once the Americans got on board, it suddenly became a war against terrorism. Hezbollah is not exactly a terrorist organization. It's a militia that basically attacks the army. In that sense, I guess you could call them guerrilla, but they are not. I mean, Hamas is different. Hamas does engage and did engage in terrorism, suicide bombings of civilians and so forth. So it does get very, very complicated. But we tackle it from a number of angles. There's no question about it. The settlers are not popular. And the majority of Israelis today, and it's been this way for over 10 years, are ready to give up virtually all the territory. There's no longer talk of needing this territory for security reasons, strategic depth, and so forth. It has no meaning militarily anymore. So you don't hear that argument. It's the settlers who are there who basically want to hold on to the territory, and the settlers, fortunately, are not popular, as we saw with the Gaza withdrawal. They launched an enormous campaign, and an emotional campaign, and they didn't succeed. People don't care and do not support the settlers. In that sense, the population's ready to get out. They feel, I think most of the population feel that the holding on to the territories is actually a liability. The question is how to get out. And because of the failure of the Oslo Accords, the breakdown of the Camp David talks, the Second Intifada, which was very, very bad for Israel. Very bad. I can't say that strongly enough.
In what sense? In the
terrorism.
But the loss of life, or sort of attacking Israel's core sense of its
loss of life.
Loss of life.
I mean, it's the first time Israelis were scared. You know, we've had terrorism before, but you have this big macho, we're fine. That didn't happen in this Intifada. We were scared because every other day there was a terrorist attack. You never knew where it was coming from. It was very serious. And coming on the heels of the failure of the peace process, led to this idea that there's no partner. And so this is basically the attitude on both sides, by the way. The Palestinians were terribly disillusioned with Oslo and the, quote, negotiations. And so you get this radical side on both sides. How do we handle it? First of all, of course, a major campaign for years about the settlements, so that people continuously know how much more land we're taking and what it means for the Israeli public and so on. The second thing is simply to say that clearly the conflict isn't serving Israel. The occupation is harming Israel, and going at it, I must say, very much from a self-interest idea, because it's very hard today to persuade Israelis that the Palestinians are gentle and want peace. We try to, I mean, through dialogue and appearing with Palestinians, to say, look, for pragmatic reasons, they have agreed long ago to a two-state solution. Population on both sides support two-state solution. And so we simply try to make the argument that holding on to the territories and continuing with the settlements perpetuates the conflict, and that it's the conflict, it's the occupation that is causing the trouble and bringing us insecurity. It's not an easy argument, as I say, because people feel on both sides that there's no partner. But the other thing is that today, if you're going to blow up the issue of Iran and radical Islam, then it should be obvious that the Arab-Israeli conflict, specifically the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, merely serves the militants on the other side. It's a vehicle for them to whip up, mobilize support. So even taking it from that angle, if you want to put it tactically, it happens to be true. I mean, the Lebanon War basically strengthened the militants around the Middle East and inside the Palestinian community, because they saw this standing up to this Israeli war machine. That does not serve our interests. I mean, you can talk in very pragmatic terms, but I think the basic problem is that the majority of Israelis and the majority of Palestinians are ready for the two-state solution. The real problem is this unilateralism, this idea that there's no partner. And I think probably, ultimately, the major issue today is getting our own government to say, okay, we know what these solutions are out there. There are lots of solutions out there. Let's do it. I think the United States has a role here. This issue of talking with Syria. We could have peace with Syria. I'm convinced of it. The Syrians have been trying for over 2 years to open negotiations because of their own domestic problems. We've had a number of prime ministers, including right-wing prime ministers, who've been willing to give up the Golan Heights, which is obviously a price we have to pay for peace. The issue when there were negotiations was over a very small area of land that was disputed in a corner of the Sea of Galilee. We could reach a peace. I mean, Assad said just recently, in 6 months we could have an agreement. It's the United States that is opposed to talks between Israel and Syria, because the United States has its own problems with Syria. I've been advocating, and in the movement we're advocating some kind of package deal. Let the Americans get into this and make a deal with the Syrians over Iraq and various issues. But at the moment, it's the Americans who are holding us back. There are many members of the present government in Israel who were interested in negotiating with Syria. But Olmert, the prime minister, has said repeatedly he will not do it. And I'm convinced that it's because of the United States.
Before we talk about the U.S., I want to ask you about the way Israel responded in the Lebanon War and escalated, and two issues come up. The first is the notion that the military was unprepared because it had been spending too much time with the occupation, and a new generation of Israeli soldiers were unprepared for this. And then the second thing is that the leadership of Israel, the coalitions formed so that there is a level of a lack of insight, a lack of skill in leading the country in making decisions about war and peace that Israel has never experienced before. Could you address those 2 points?
You're referring to having a defense minister, Amir Peretz, who was not qualified to be a defense minister.
Right, and who basically was building a new Labor Party based on issues of social welfare and social justice, and is suddenly made defense minister. And when I was in Israel before the war, he was defending an increase in the defense budget, as a price, even at the price of cutting social welfare budgets.
Well, there are a couple of issues here. Very specifically, Amir Peretz, of course, was a supporter of Peace Now, and he's an old friend. We had very high hopes when he took office, including when he took office as defense minister. I mean, there was the fear that it was a trap, that it was a position in which he would fail, and that was one of the reasons that he was placed there. And of course, that's been the result. We've been very much disappointed. But I don't know that we could blame everything on him or on this, quote, inexperience. It may have been a factor. The fact that we had both an inexperienced prime minister who would never have been prime minister. It was a sheer fluke that he was number 2. He had been very low. He barely got into the Knesset on the last the Likud elections a number of years ago. A very skilled politician, but certainly inexperienced when we talk about being prime minister. But we've had poor prime ministers before. We can put that aside, I think. There are those who say that the quick reaction and overreaction was a result of their inexperience, and possibly they're trying to prove that that they could handle it, and that we're just as good as the generals and just as good as ex-generals, and we can, and therefore I'm not sure I'm entirely convinced about that. I'm not entirely
in other words, what they're arguing.
Yes, that argument that the reason for the escalation was the inexperience and the need to prove that they could handle this kind of situation. I'm not convinced that's what happened. I think the military had much more influence here, and my own theory, if you could call it that, is that we forget, and unfortunately we forgot throughout the whole war and to this day, that it all started in Gaza with the attack, a Hamas attack across the border, and the capture of the soldier Gilad Shalit, who's still in captivity. And then I think it was about 2 weeks later, comes this, what was viewed by Israel and certainly by the army as a second kidnapping, where Hezbollah crossed the border and took, in this case, kidnapped 2 soldiers and killed a few others. I think the army responded, how dare they? How can they do this again? And they closed it.
So it's one adversary.
Exactly. And they clothed it in terms of our deterrence. If they can keep doing this, we've got to teach them a lesson. We've got to show that they can't keep doing this. I think that's what happened. And I think the military were particularly strong in this. And the inexperience of the government led this to happen. And the reason I say that is that we have to bear in mind that this kind of attack by Hezbollah had occurred before, a number of times. They had crossed the border, in some cases succeeded in kidnapping soldiers, in other cases didn't succeed, and we never responded with escalation. And one of the reasons, and this is under Sharon, one of the reasons was that it was a known fact that if we did respond and turned into war, not only do you have the danger of war with Syria, but you're going to have civilian population under fire. Because we knew that they had rockets, they had the Katyushas and so forth. And no government before apparently was willing to do that, since it wasn't an existential threat. Just to open fire on the northern border and to come over and to kidnap some soldiers, it's not pleasant, certainly not for those living on the northern border, but it's not an existential threat. And, but this government responded as it did. It may be because of inexperience. I suspect it's very much the pressure of the military. And here I do think that the Chief of Staff played a role. I think the Chief of Staff, more than anybody else, is culpable here.
And was the army, was the grunt soldier, the leadership at the lower levels, ill-prepared and ill-equipped to engage in a war that was being asked of them? Well,
there are 2 things here. One of the things that I said at the very outset is this is a guerrilla war, and you're not going to win. And that's something the Army should have known from the beginning.
And the Air Force, I mean, because, yeah.
I mean, this is the whole idea, is we're going to do this first just by the Air Force so we don't have any losses. But it's an American tactic, and it's never worked. And you'd think, certainly, and it didn't have to be a Soviet specialist to know this, you'd think that they'd realize that it's just 3,000 guerrilla fighters. I mean, you can't win this war. I think that's to begin with, is that no matter how prepared we'd been, this was a different kind of war and we weren't going to win it. There's no winning it. You could push them back, but you could weaken them, take out some of their launchers, but this is not serious. They rearm and so forth. The other thing is, yes, it is true that training had been foregone because the army was busy with the Intifada. And when you're busy with an Intifada, the kind of warfare is entirely different. You bring in a tank into these narrow streets of Nablus, and the Palestinians have basically light weapons, and you crush a house, or it's a whole different ballgame.
It's a policing operation.
It's basically policing. It's a little bit more, but it's a very different kind of thing. And your opponent has nothing, basically. Just it has light weapons virtually. So they certainly didn't have anti-tank missiles. They didn't have rockets of any serious kind. And so it is true that there was a lack of training, and it was known. It was a calculated risk. So that probably had an effect. Although I think that fighting a guerrilla war was. And I think one of the lessons of this, the quote, defeat, was that a guerrilla war is something that Israel doesn't know how to fight, which is very dangerous. And the Syrians, for example, are using this. I don't think that they're planning a guerrilla war on, facing the Golan. It's a different terrain. It wouldn't work. But they're using that. It's a sort of a demagogic type of thing to use amongst the Palestinians as well. Oh, you see, Israel can't fight this kind of war. But that's just one of the perhaps negative outcomes of the war.
Let's talk now about the U.S.-Israeli relationship, because it's several times in this interview you have commented on aspects of that relationship that have had consequences for what Israel is and the way it acts in the world. You mentioned globalization. Globalization is an American phenomenon. You mentioned negotiations with principles in the region that Israel is prevented from doing, because it seems that the Middle East is very fragmented, and for a small country like Israel, there's great strength in being able to play local actors play them off against each other. And you suggested, well, maybe we should move towards Syria, but the U.S. is preventing it. What is your overall view? Because it sounds to me like you're saying that there are real negative aspects. Obviously, there are positive aspects, but there are real negative aspects to this relationship as they affect Israel.
Well, we needed the United States. I am convinced during the Cold War that the restraining factor, and I mentioned before I thought the Soviets were restraining the Arabs, the Arab states, because of American support for Israel. And I do believe it was vital to Israel during the Cold War. I think American support is important, very important for Israel, but I prefer to see it in the form that we saw during the Clinton administration, as support that was designed to bring about a settlement, to become involved, to try to bring the sides together. And in that sense, I think it was extremely positive. Even under the first Bush administration, where James Baker got angry and said, you guys want to continue to build settlements, and then do it without our aid, so to speak. In that sense, from my point of view, it was positive. It's not that I want to see a boycott on Israel, but there was, I think, a positive role because Israel's dependent upon the United States. But because Israel's dependent upon the United States, when you get a president like Bush, they're not exactly using the American pressure in the right direction. And I think it can be very negative. If the United States, look, the truth is that today the United States is the only superpower. And while the Europeans are very helpful and they pour a good deal of money into the region and they have goodwill, I would say, they're not a force, they're not a power. It's the Americans. And the Americans could, if they wanted to, bring us together. They could. They could bring Israel and the Palestinians together. They could force us to talk to each other again. They could force us. And certainly they could release us to talk with the Syrians. So I think it's not all black and white. It depends who's in the White House and how they want to use that power. And I think this is true of all countries. It's certainly the little countries. It's not just Israel that's dependent upon the United States. But again, it's a question of how the United States uses that power. Today, we have a very weak prime minister, and so he's all the more dependent upon the United States. I can understand that kind of situation, but I would certainly prefer to see what I said earlier, some kind of package deal where maybe even somebody like Bush could say for pragmatic reasons to try to do a, quote, a Libya with Syria. Make an agreement between the United States and Syria that could be used by this administration, which of course would be in our interest. I don't see Bush going in that direction, but that's the direction I would want him to go. So part of our task, by the way, is to try to influence Washington in the direction
of
being the
Israel
peace movement, of a peace movement with a very strong Americans for Peace Now, a very strong counterpart in the United States, whose major task is to try to persuade Washington to press for peace, not to permit Israel to continue building settlements. How you do that can be very subtle, but it's in Israel's interest to reach peace, and therefore we feel it's clearly a pro-Israeli policy to push for peace, and America could do that. But instead what it's doing is unfortunately just the opposite.
As you know, Professors Mersheimer from Chicago and Professor Walt from Harvard have provoked a debate about the influence of the Israeli lobby on U.S. foreign policy. How does that debate and the direction it may or may not take affect relations with Israel and the peace movement in Israel?
Well, I think that that AIPAC, the Israeli lobby in Washington, is very strong. I think in that article they exaggerate. I don't think that all of American policy, even all of American policy in the Middle East, is controlled by the Israel lobby. I think America, and certainly an involvement with Iraq, is certainly an American determined policy. And we can go back in history where America had interest in Egypt, Jordan certainly, and Iraq for many years, that was not easily accommodated by its relationship with Israel. And there were times when it was very rough. The Israeli-American relationship was rough as the United States was pursuing its own interests in Egypt or in Saudi Arabia or what have you. So that I don't think that the interest in Israel or the Jewish lobby determined American policy. I think that basically what it tried to do was to make sure that whatever America was doing on this other level with the Arab states would not be harmful to Israel. Having said that, I do think that American policy regarding the Arab-Israeli conflict is very much influenced by AIPAC, very much so, and at times even at odds with the Israeli government. When Rabin was prime minister, both times, but certainly the second time in the whole Oslo process, AIPAC was out of step. AIPAC was still supporting a right-wing position, and basically a position that was not in Israel's interests and was not in the interests of the government of Israel at that time. But I do think that they have a good deal of influence, because their influence, of course, is mainly in Congress. Less so the White House, in my opinion, because you have well-to-do Jewish constituents, important Jewish constituents, and that's how AIPAC works, of course. And your other groups, such as Americans for Peace Now, the Israel Policy Forum, these other peace-oriented American Jewish organizations have greater influence, I would think, amongst Democrats in America, the progressive public in America, but they're not the establishment. Mm-hmm. They're not your elected or selected Jewish professionals, as they're called. And so their influence is less. But I think, bottom line, I think it's an exaggeration, and here I think unfair to say that American policy towards Iran or American policy towards Iraq or the war in Iraq and all of this is because of America's support for Israel. I do not think that's the case at all. And I think that America has, and Bush apparently has, his own interests. Some of them coincide with Israel's interests, and some of them clearly do not.
What is on the horizon for Israel with regard to Iran? How much of a threat is Iran? And do the U.S. and Israel have common interests in meeting that threat?
I find that a very hard question to answer. Until the present leadership in Iran, until Ahmadinejad was elected, I did not think Iran was a threat. I thought Iran was going in the direction of greater and greater pragmatism. The thinking was that Rafsanjani would be reelected, been president before, that he might come back, and that his was a policy that was moving, in fact, towards reconciliation. Their stated position prior to Ahmadinejad had been that any agreement worked out between Israel and the Palestinians would be acceptable to them, which was fine. It meant Iran was not a threat to us. I always felt that Iran was a threat mainly to the Gulf states, wanting to be a power in the Gulf. Ahmadinejad is a different ballgame, and he is scary. He really is.
Mm-hmm.
He makes statements that are unbelievable about destroying Israel. Israel should be taken off the map and so forth. There's no denying these statements, and so it is a scary phenomenon. And I can frankly only hope that he won't stay in power too long. He's not alone. I mean, clearly he has the support of the mullahs. This is how it works. But nonetheless, they are permitting him to say these things, and he's clearly set the country on a course of conflict rather than conciliation.
And are are in this area, are the U.S. and Israel's interests such that they can take a common path toward dealing with Iran?
I don't know. I'm somebody who's always believed that the way to go with enemies is engagement and not confrontation. I believe that with the Soviet Union. I think it's the case with Hamas, for example, and I think it's the case with Iran. I think that engagement would be a lot smarter than confrontation, but I don't see anybody taking that path. I certainly am hopeful that the United States doesn't decide to take a crazy position, that is to attack Iran, which I think would be absurd. And we would be the victims, because any response would not be to the United States, it would be on us. I can only hope that the Americans will not go in that direction. I don't think Israel wants it to go in that direction. I'm not sure exactly what the government thinks America or the international community should do. The hope is that it can somehow stop the nuclear development there. So I'd say, yes, there is a mutual interest, but the way in which you pursue that might be very different. I'm not sure today there's anything Israel can do about Iran. That's my feeling. I mean, if it were possible to open a dialogue with Iran, which is totally impossible, the Iranians are not interested, and Americans aren't going to permit a dialogue with Syria, they're certainly not going to permit it with Iran. So it isn't even an option at the moment, but that would be the way to go.
Galia, on that note, I want to thank you very much for being here today and taking the time to give us your perspectives on Israel's relations with the United States and its strategic position. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.